Chapter 5 The American Revolution, 1763 to 1783, Parts 1 and 2. Part 1 Crisis Begins. The experience and costs of the 7 Years' War led Great Britain, where King George assumed the throne in 1760, to consolidate its growing empire and make the colonists share in its costs. Before the war, the British had attempted to impose new trading regulations, reinforcing the Navigation Acts, which limited and controlled the colonists' trade. In the 1740s, the Board of Trade, responsible for colonial affairs, had attempted to expand its influence over colonial governments, trying, for example, to bring colonial laws into conformity with royal instructions. These new regulations failed, in part because colonists ignored them. During the 7 Years' War, the British had treated colonists as equals, recognizing their contributions to winning the conflict. After the war, in the mid-1760s, the British returned to viewing colonists as subordinates, whose role was to enrich the mother country. Without precedent, British rulers sought imperial reforms to make administration of the American colonies more efficient and systematic, and to raise funds to help pay for the war, which cost Britain far more than its colonies, and finance their empire. To them, it seemed fair to force Americans to follow the Navigation Acts, help reduce war debt, and pay for continued British protection. Furthermore, almost all British believed that Parliament represented the entire empire and rightfully legislated for it. Millions of Britons had no representatives in Parliament, but according to the theory of virtual representation, these British were constituents of each member of the Parliament. The duty of each was to represent the whole empire, not simply his district. Americans' argument that they could not be taxed without enjoying direct representation in Parliament did not find much support in Britain. In the early 1760s, British efforts to combat smuggling by issuing general search warrants and its proclamation of 1763 barring further settlement on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains sparked protest in the colonies. But this response was little compared to the colonists' outrage in 1764 and 1765 over new laws, including the Sugar, Revenue, and Currency Acts, measures which colonists believed infringed on their liberties and limited the profits they earned from previously less regulated trade. Ideas and icons of liberty, such as liberty trees and liberty poles, infused American colonists' resistance to the Stamp Act. Inspired by colonists in Boston who had protested the Sugar and Currency Acts, colonial leaders formed committees that communicated with each other and successfully coordinated efforts to prevent the Stamp Act's implementation. In cities such as New York and Boston, crowds often organized by the Sons of Liberty destroyed the stamps and forced those administering the law to resign. The coercive activities of the Sons of Liberty, supported mostly by urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, frightened both imperial officers in the colonies and even colonial elite who opposed the Stamp Act, but preferred orderly and peaceful protests. Though the Americans' resistance and pressure from London merchants and manufacturers afraid of losing American markets led the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, that body simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which affirmed that Parliament had the authority and power to pass laws in the future that affected the colonies, including new taxes. The 1760s also saw considerable internal social turmoil within the colonies. In the western back country of many colonies, the conflicting land claims of settlers, speculators, colonial governments, and Indians sparked disputes. Rural settlers and farmers had long resented the power and influence of land speculators and large proprietors. In the mid-1760s, a group of South Carolina settlers calling themselves regulators protested the underrepresentation of Western settlements in the colony's assembly and the failure to establish local governments that could regularize land titles and impose law and order. In North Carolina, groups of small farmers taking in the same name refused to pay taxes, disrupted courts, and attacked local officials and the property of land speculators, merchants, and lawyers. These armed farmers were suppressed only in 1771 by the colony's militia. In the mid-1760s, tenants on the large estates of landowners in New York's Hudson River Valley, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, stopped paying rent and began to seize land. But they were also suppressed by colonial militia and British troops. Small farmers in Vermont and other parts of New England also took up arms to defend their land claims and resist colonial authorities. Such social turmoil made some colonial elites fear that resistance to British imperial authority threatened their own power and authority over their subordinates within the colonies, and they cautioned against further protests of British rule. Part 2. The Road to Revolution. In 1767, the British government imposed a new set of taxes on the American colonies designed by Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend, the government's chief financial minister. Taking at their word American statements that they did not object to taxes on trade, the Townsend duties taxed goods imported to the colonies and established new Board of Customs Commissioners to collect the taxes, suppress smuggling, and raise funds to free judges and governors from their financial dependence on colonial assemblies. Although American merchants opposed the duties, the colonial opposition developed more slowly compared to the response to the Stamp Act. A colonial boycott on imported British goods developed in Boston and spread to the southern colonies, where many southern planters hoped to use the boycott to reduce their debt to British merchants. Boycotters celebrated the virtue of American resistance and denigrated the luxury of British society by producing their own homespun clothing. Although urban artisans welcomed an end to competition from British imports and strongly supported non-importation, urban merchants were at first reluctant to honor the boycott, and in some cities, extra-legal committees and crowds attempted to enforce it. Boston was at the center of resistance. Royal British troops had been stationed there since a 1768 riot against British attempts to enforce trade regulations, and the unpopular troops had been competing for jobs on the waterfront with the city's laborers. On March 5, 1770, a fight between Bostonians and British soldiers escalated into an armed confrontation that left 5 Bostonians dead. The commander and 8 soldiers were put on trial and defended by John Adams, who opposed both British policies and lower-class crowd actions against them. Though only 2 of the British soldiers were convicted of manslaughter and the rest were found not guilty, Paul Revere and other colonists helped stir up indignation against the British through inaccurate but widely circulated propaganda depicting the incident as a massacre of unarmed Bostonians. Non-importation temporarily cut British imports by a third, and although the boycott on the Townsend duties faltered by 1770, British merchants' fear of future trade disruptions led to the repeal of all the Townsend duties, except for the tax on tea. The British also agreed to remove the troops from Boston, and American merchants abandoned the boycott. A controversy within Britain over the treatment of John Wilkes reinforced Americans' sense that political corruption and other ills were eroding British liberty. A radical journalist who had scandalized authorities with writings on the king and ministry, Wilkes was elected to Parliament from London but expelled. Cries of "Wilkes and liberty" rallied colonists and Britons in the mother country. British American Protestants were also troubled by rumors that the Anglican Church planned to send bishops to the colonies and, worried that religious courts to punish dissenters would be established, further feared for their liberties. The next colonial crisis demonstrated how events throughout the British Empire reverberated in America. The East India Company was a giant trading monopoly that effectively ruled recently acquired British possessions in India. When a speculative bubble that destroyed the company's stock, in which many British merchants, bankers, and other elites had invested, the British government decided to help rescue the company by marketing its surplus tea in North America. By this time, tea was no longer a luxury good, but a consumer necessity popular among all social classes in Britain and America. The British government, headed by Lord North, gave the company advantages that allowed it to dump low-priced tea on the American market, which undercut colonial merchants and smugglers, and it wanted another move that threatened the colonial assembly's control over finance. Although the tea tax was not new, many colonists argued that a tax on a large new body of tea imports would acknowledge Britain's right to tax the colonies. Mounting opposition culminated in what would much later become known as the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists, disguised as Indians, dumped tea from the British ships into Boston Harbor, causing enormous loss to the East India Company. North's government and the Parliament responded with a series of punitive laws the colonies came to call the Intolerable Acts. They closed the port of Boston until all of the East India Company had been compensated, altered the Massachusetts Charter of 1691 by curtailing town meetings and authorizing the governor to appoint council members previously elected, and allowed British military commanders to house troops in colonists' private homes. Simultaneously, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended Canada's boundaries and allowed for legal toleration of the Roman Catholic Church in that new British province. Meant to secure the allegiance of Britain's new subjects, the Quebec Act also caused many colonists, especially New England Protestants, to fear that the British now threatened both their political and their religious freedoms.